Hello and welcome from me, Philip Nothard and Curtis Hutchinson to this special Motor Trade Radio podcast brought to you in association with eBay Motors Group. So many thanks again for joining us in this 20th in our series of special interviews themed around sharing best practices as car retailers continue to manage their way through the COVID-19 crisis. As you know, previous interviews with Suzuki boss Dale Wyatt, Mitsubishi MD Rob Linley, Marshall Motors Dash Gupta, and Adrian Daly of the Finance and Leasing Association, and many more are still available to stream online from Apple and Google Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud and Deezer.
Now today we're delighted to welcome our special guest, Neil Addley, founder of JudgeService, the online dealer customer service, insight and reviews service. Welcome to the show, Neil.
Hi, thanks. It's great to be here.
Yeah, no, great to have you on the podcast, Neil. By way of a brief backgrounder for listeners, you launched JudgeService in 2011 following a career in the motor trade, which included head of marketing roles at major dealer groups, namely Perry's, CD Bramall and Reg Vardy, as well as key suppliers including RBS and motors.co.uk.
So, Neil, again, welcome to the show, and it's a pleasure to have you on at long last. So, probably the best off starting around what happened through lockdown, and as we know, the dealerships were closed across the UK from the end of March until the phase reopening from the 1st of June, and with doors closed during this period, and dealer websites took on the heightened importance. What role did you think ratings and reviews play during this period from your perspective?
Sure. Well, there's plenty of evidence that reviews really help keep engagement of people on websites and also encourage customers to be confident in dealing with the business. And I guess this is particularly true when dealerships were unable to welcome walk-ins. And so customers had no other way really of verifying whether this was a great place to do business with. So I think reviews, ratings are undoubtedly a key when it comes to choosing where you're going to buy a vehicle from. But probably more important for us was during lockdown, we did a lot of surveys pro bono, if you like, for our clients, and to understand what their customers were feeling about lockdown and what would happen when we came out of it. So this really helped inform our clients and to an extent the rest of the trade of the customer concerns, but also of the pent-up demand that we could see for servicing and used cars.
Now, following on from that, Neil, you've been closely tracking website usage, both pre and post-lockdown, and you've recently published some research about a boom that you've seen in local searches. Can you take us through some of those findings?
Yeah, for sure. So what we have seen, and it's quite pronounced actually, is a huge surge in people buying locally. And by that, I mean within 5 miles of where they live. That's increased from about 32% of people pre-pandemic, so in January, February this year, to 53% of people post-lockdown, so since the industry reopened on June the 1st. And this is particularly pronounced when it comes to volume cars, if you like, or volume brands, with that being 57% of people buying locally. What's also interesting is that people buying from a long distance, which we define as over 50 miles, has also increased since lockdown was lifted, as people shift to buying online. So that's risen from 10 to 15% of people on normal brands, and on premium brands, that's even more, to 19% of people for premium brands. So I suppose it's the middle distance, the medium distance purchases that have been squeezed, with some people wanting to buy locally, almost creating their own sort of purchase bubble, if you like, and other people prepared to buy anywhere online because they expect to get the car delivered.
But that's quite interesting. So the increase in local searches was mainly based around volume brands. Is that what you found?
It's much more pronounced on volume brands. So the more expensive the vehicle, the more likely you are to have travelled or have had it delivered via the internet.
And do you think that's a significant shift? I mean, was that something that was there in the first place? Was there a disparity between the mainstream versus the premium brands in terms of distance travelled, or was it a fairly level market?
There's always been a intention to travel further if you're prepared to buy a more premium brand. I guess it's the finding exactly the right model and spending a bit more on it means that you're prepared to travel a bit further. But this has been exaggerated, I think, by the situation. I think that more and more people are looking online to buy cars, and I think that's something that's pretty likely to stay.
And in terms of, fantastic, interesting findings there. But does that, what do you believe? Does that show the power of the local marketing? And from a dealer's perspective, should they be looking at focusing and placing long distance sales to attract customers from outside of their local area? And could this then also will this prompt a growth in demand for online sales? I mean, what's your view as to what should the dealers now be thinking, either in the immediate short term post lockdown and recovery from COVID, and potentially the longer term change of behaviours from consumers?
Sure, that's a really good question. So I think the local angle is interesting, and we've seen an increase in people saying that they've bought a car after engaging on social media or from where they've had their last car serviced. So certainly in the short term, I think a focus on local activity, whether that's social stuff or even giving vouchers to people in your service department, makes absolutely perfect sense. But in the long run, the biggest increase that we've seen has been people saying they found the actual vehicle they were going to buy online. And that's gone up from 21% of people pre-lockdown to 27% of people post-lockdown. And I think that change is probably here to stay. I think that the local purchase thing is probably a short-term thing, or not short, but medium-term thing, that will gradually relax as we get used to the new norm, or maybe there's a vaccine or better treatments for COVID.
And do you believe it's kind of, do you think there's been an influence from, because obviously there was the, post-lockdown, England versus the sort of, Wales, there was this travel restriction in place. And do you think some of that was influenced by sort of localised travel restrictions, or do you think it's broader than that?
I think it was just a bit of a mess by government policy across the four nations, to be honest.
Yeah.
I think joined up thinking has been something that's been quite lacking during this. Although, in the end, I guess to get out of this, there will need to be regional decisions made, whether that's local lockdowns or whatever. But what we've also seen is a marked change in consumer attitude to buying online, where before lockdown, again, around 5% of people said that they'd normally think about buying a car online, whereas that's risen to 16% of people now, which makes it really important that dealers are working with their vendors to make sure they've got online purchase ready stuff, whether it's finance, part exchange, or just being brilliant at the basics. The internet's become an even more powerful tool, and that's been accelerated, I believe, by COVID, but will be here to stay.
And Neil, looking at specifically at reviews and ratings, what would you say are the most common customer gripes about dealers, and how should dealers be addressing them?
So the first thing I'd say is you need to measure your own gripes. Whether you do that yourself or you use someone like us to do it, it's up to you. But you need to have a handle on what's going on in your business and what your team are saying to your customers. So the most common gripes are really around communication and rushed retailing. So what do I mean by that? So communication, firstly, customers, when they're trying to buy a car, you wouldn't believe the number that say that people don't get back to them. Yeah. So that's a big gripe. Second one would be when they're trying to arrange delivery of their vehicle, the disinterest sometimes from some people in getting back to the customer to sort that out. And finally, there's the post-contact call. I was always taught that 3 days, 3 months, and 3 months thereafter, keep in contact with your customers. And so we measure that as part of what we do. And again, that's something that only around half the time is done effectively. So communication is the first thing. And particularly if it's supposed to be a lost sale, it's mad that we're not following people up. Then the other gripes come around what we call rushed retailing. That can be that finance hasn't been explained properly in some cases. And the others would be where we're trying to rush delivery. So either the car's not mechanically prepared properly or the car's being poorly valeted. I know when I was selling cars a long time ago, occasionally you try and get a car through valet and you'd have to cut corners because you'd promised delivery too soon. But it's just a case of taking a little bit more time and making sure we do the job right, because customers would rather have the car in mint condition than perhaps having it a day early.
And following on from that, Neil, in terms of the pandemic and dealerships reopening from the beginning of June, are you finding that customers are possibly a bit more forgiving now in their reviews? In terms of how they're dealing with retailers?
Yeah, so we specifically ask about social distancing and stuff like that in the surveys, and customers' feedback has been extremely positive. I guess, unlike other retailers, we have the advantage of having big facilities, so we're able to social distance. Talking to some of our clients, the challenge is more around making sure the customers do social distance rather than us providing the facility ourselves.
So in terms of the customer reviews, and you say obviously integral part of the online retailing, and you mentioned earlier about obviously that acceleration in that online experience of purchasing their vehicles, and you kind of mentioned it there within the dealers around that it's more about the customers adhering to the social distancing rather than probably the dealers enforcing it to a certain extent. But what is the type of typical feedback that you get about the dealers and having their reviews and ratings on their website? Because as you said before, that increase in activity online, we've talked about obviously the acceleration of that adoption of that e-commerce proposition as COVID has highlighted those that didn't have a sort of a cohesive proposition for consumers. But what do you believe? Are the dealers in the hall embracing the reviews and the transparency of reviews on their website, and really to add to that, and have you how have they evolved, and is there still some resilience from having reviews on their website?
So we push review content not just to their website and ours, but also to Autotrader and Motors.co.uk. And I guess when we first started, and sometimes when we bring a new client on, they are a little wary that they're going to get bad reviews. But the truth is, most people, if they're spending 15 grand on a car, they're buying it from someone they like. And so most of the reviews you get are positive. And by asking for feedback, what you get is the positive view of the majority, rather than if you leave it to their own devices, you only really get reviews from the highly motivated, disgruntled few. So actually, when you look at the reviews that we get, 95% of people are really happy with the experience. So we urge dealers to use the reviews to promote across their business and the other channels, but to use the insight more than that to make sure that they improve the customer experience and continually do so, because it might be perfect right now, but things change in terms of the sales team themselves, maybe the leadership, and so you do need to keep on top of what the customer experience is in every single dealership. Yeah. And so that's why we have real simple rules, which is that you should send us all your data of all your customers, no cherry picking, survey everyone, and you should either publish everything or publish nothing, because otherwise you lack integrity in the way you're using your review content.
Yeah, I think you're right. In terms of that, it's, you don't want to see 100% 5-star reviews, do you? Because I suppose there's a consumer perspective that that's unrealistic. I mean, you're into some of the Amazon world, aren't you, with that kind of thing? But
sure.
thinking about the COVID recovery, have you noticed anything, or has there been any feedback in terms of consumers' expectations? Are they have they dropped their expectations because of things like COVID? Is there a bit of a relaxation of what they expect from a dealer, or do you think it's remained as it was pre-COVID? Or because potentially you've got new people entering the online space, haven't you, in terms of that purchasing a vehicle online, and you've got, in many ways, you've got retailers that didn't necessarily have an online proposition, and they adopted it, during COVID, and were kind of new to that marketplace.
Sure. I think, and this is a little bit anecdotal rather than statistical, immediately after people started coming back into dealerships for their vehicles to be serviced or to purchase, there was definitely a feeling of real goodwill to all men. I think that as people got more used to the post-COVID situation, then we've returned to a much more normal state in terms of the feedback that we see from customers. That's not that it's got worse or better, it's just about the same as it was before. I think other than the wish to shop more locally in many cases, I think that things in terms of car buying have to a large extent returned to normal, where retailers, resilient bunch, and we've adapted, and maybe we're doing test drives without a salesman with the customer. We're doing click and collect, or we're doing home delivery. But customers' expectations, I think, have more or less returned to what they were pre-lockdown.
And following on from that, Neil, and last question for you. With the 70 plate change upon us from next week, what is the best advice you can give dealers today regarding getting their websites ready for an influx in interest in new, nearly new, and used in what could be a bigger than normal September?
Yes, so I think you're right. It could well be bigger than normal. Certainly, many retailers that we're talking to are expecting to see a really strong end to the year, not just perhaps September, but into October and November as well. So I would obviously counsel all retailers to make sure that they've got a customer insight program and reviews on their website. But I think the key things for me are that the website's never been more important. And that's really being brilliant at the basics, whether it's a new vehicle or a used or a late plate vehicle. That's photos, pricing, spec. Customers aren't forgiving if you don't have those right, because they just won't inquire. I think as well, particularly given the paucity of stock at the moment, that we should really be focusing on part exchanges. It's a great way of sourcing stock, and it's a deal winner. We've actually created a survey that dealers can use to measure their part exchange valuations, which is available for anyone to use right now. And then the third, I'd say, is don't waste leads. So whether it's using someone like us or doing it in-house, third-party follow-up is a surefire way to sell more cars. And then I guess my final thought would be, remember, car buying should be fun. It's an important part of people's lives, and they should be enjoying the experience, whether we're post-COVID or whether we were pre-COVID.
So, I mean, fantastic insight there. And I think you're right. I think you can get too hung up, I suppose, on reviews, can't you, Neil? I think I think it is what it is. I think if you're doing the business right, you're looking after your customers, you're meeting their expectations, you are transparent. We are moving in we've been in that direction change towards digital and that online end-to-end proposition for some time. COVID has accelerated it, obviously, in terms of the recent months, but I think what you're saying there is there has been some dynamic changes around that distance travelled, type of vehicles people are prepared to travel for. I think there's are you going to go and travel 200-300 miles for that vehicle that is on 95% of forecourts in some form or another, or actually you prefer to travel for that something that's a little bit more unique, a little bit more different in spec and meets your requirements. But I think from what you're saying here, I think that transparency is good, and I think it is about being transparent, feeding everything into operations and businesses such as yourself, so that you can demonstrate the results. But I think you sort of opened it right at the start, I think, if I'm correct, that that area of not getting back to people and not responding to emails and inquiries come in, I think that is probably a key point that many retailers have either adopted or haven't adopted, dependent on their business.
Sure. Yeah, I think this is just a massive opportunity to sell more cars and vans.
Yeah. No, it's good. It's good. I mean, to be fair, thank you for coming on. I think we've known each other, and you've known Curtis for a while, and obviously what you're doing for the dealerships throughout lockdown and pre-lockdown, and obviously with now the survey around the part exchanges and things like that. I think that's a key element that the more that moves on into the online space, we need to understand how the consumers are reacting to it, don't we, as a business and a sector. So thanks for coming on, and it's really appreciated that you eventually come onto the podcast.
No, thank you very much for having me, and have a great day.
Many thanks, Neil. Great to catch up with you again, and many thanks for a good timely update on how dealers need to keep on top of reviews and ratings and their websites in general, especially as we head into the plate change. That's all we have time for now. You've been listening to this special Motor Trade Radio podcast brought to you in association with eBay Motors Group. Please like and share on social media, as it's important during these times for the dealer community to work together and share experiences and best practices. Many thanks to you for listening and supporting the podcast. Philip and I will be back with the industry headlines on Saturday. Until then, stay safe and stay well.
Yeah.